Hello and welcome to our interview with Luke Carman. Luke Carman is a Western Sydney boy. How old are you now, Luke? You allowed to say?
I'm getting on.
You're still boy.
I must
You're still
be 37
boyish.
years old or something.
You're still boyish, though. Those boyish good looks. It actually comes up in your latest book. The fact that was it your father said you're meant to be a model for J. Crew or something, and you went, no, I just want to write stories.
Exactly.
So Luke is
catalog model. That's what he wanted from me.
catalog model. Right.
I have a feeling it's more to do with, when you share genes with somebody, you're more likely to find them attractive. I think it was a kind of genetic bias. You know what I mean?
Maybe. So Luke is a fiction writer. He's been published in several journals. He holds a PhD from Western Sydney University. That's correct, isn't it? WSU or UWS as it was known then. It's changed.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you told me that his thesis was in shame and Australian literature, which we're going to come back to because that sounds, well, interesting. Now, Luke's first book was An Elegant Young Man, and his most recent book is a series of essays on the writing life or being a writer, I guess, called Intimate Antipathies. They're both published by Giramondo.
Exactly. Yep.
Giramondo Press. So, Luke, welcome and thank you for joining us. Let's go back to the beginning. You're from Liverpool, and you were born and bred in Liverpool.
Yep.
At what point did you go, it's time for Liverpool to have a writer that represents Liverpool? I mean, I know there have been others, but what made you go, you should be the latest iteration of this idea?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, James. Thanks, WestWords. Hello, everybody. That's an interesting question, and I think I've almost forgotten at what point that was. But I know that there was when I started at Western Sydney, for example. I did an undergrad degree in writing and publishing, and I thought, well, I have to do this because I want to be a writer, and my schooling has been so terrible. I was aware of how terrible my schooling was, which in some ways is beneficial to a writer. I avoided all the kind of imbecilities that go along with normal mass education, English teaching, and so on. But I thought, look, I'm basically illiterate in a sense, so I have to go to university to get some sort of chops if I'm going to be a writer. I thought I was going to be a fantasy writer. That's what I primarily read. I'd read some scattered classics here and there, but wasn't particularly well read. I'd read a lot, but it was all fantasy, sci-fi, genre fiction. And when I went to university, it just so happened at that time, the education that I got, probably similar to yourself when you went to university, it was very heavily French post-structuralist influenced, a lot of experimental writing in the curriculum. And so...
and very Western Hemisphere too, really, isn't it?
Oh, it was exclusively at the time. Yeah. But it was totally something that I wasn't completely unprepared for at the time, that kind of writing. And, a lot of, as I say, French influence, but a lot of poetry was probably the strongest, the thing that was most common in the curriculum. We didn't really look at novels very much or anything like that. And so I hated it all at the time. I thought, this has got nothing to do with me, nothing to do with writing. Nobody reads this stuff outside of the university, and I don't understand any of it. And we would get the theoretical underpinnings of it, like Deleuze and Guattari and all this, and 1,000 Plateaus and things, and it was mind-bending to me. I had no idea what any of it was about. But in a strange way, coming out of that, it gave me an appreciation for things which were not non-commercial, not genre fiction. I was basically ruined as a commercial, author. My prospects of becoming a fantasy writer were zero, because I'd just been given this completely distorted view of writing was, and I mean distorted in not in a non-pejorative sense, in a positive way. And anyway, I decided, well, I'll carry on at the university, and at the time, which they still do it at Western Sydney, you could do a PhD or a DCA, Doctor of Creative Arts, and if you were lucky, you got a scholarship. And I had a tutor at the time. I had some great tutors, Dr. Anna Gibbs, Dr. Marie Angel, but one of them, I can't remember who now, Dr. Maurice Williams. She said to me, look, you're crazy if you don't do a PhD here, because you'll get a scholarship and you'll be paid for 3 years to write a book, and you'll never get a better deal in your life as an author. And so I was, yeah, okay, I'll do that. And I was basically given a subject, because I thought, I don't know what makes for PhD material. I was just given a subject, and the subject I was given was deconstructing white male subjectivity in Western Sydney. And I didn't, for the life of me, know at that time what that meant. I still don't.
Yeah,
no, no, I don't. I could make something up that would probably fit. But as part of being a DCA student there, or a PhD student there at the time, you had to do this thing called a confirmation of candidature, which is you go and you sit at a panel and you tell all the professors and doctors what you're doing. And one of the professors at that panel was Professor Ivor Indyk, who was the publisher of Giramondo. And I thought, well, if I'm deconstructing white male subjectivity in Western Sydney, that does give me one opportunity, and that's to write about what Western Sydney is to me, what the people around me, people I know, my own life, which I'd never really considered up to that point. And I mean my own life as in some sort of representation of the character of the world that I lived in, I guess. And so I did that. And when Professor Indyk heard those stories, the first thing he asked me is that your life? Did that happen to you? Which I did really expect as a question at the time, because I was a fiction writer. And I said yes anyway, because it's true. And that was kind of what set me on the path of a sort of semi-autobiographical fiction from that point on. And I started to look for what was valuable or what was meaningful in my immediate environment to write about, because I could see that it had a value to people.
Did you think at any point, I mean, I'm sure this would have crossed your mind and you probably had long conversations about it, but it would have been very easy, because the protagonist or your main character in your story, his name is Luke, and he lives in Liverpool, and wants to be a writer, I believe. There's all these, it's basically you. It would have been very easy just to call him Dave and set him in Penrith, wouldn't it?
That's right.
Well,
exactly.
So why didn't you? Because the example I think of, and anyone who's watched or heard any of the podcasts I've done will know this is an example I do use occasionally. But the James Frey story, where A Million Tiny Pieces, or I think it was called, where he wrote this book that was passed off as being an autobiography, a memoir, and then he became the doyen of Oprah and the daytime talk shows, until they discovered it was actually made up. And suddenly this book that they were all going, this is one of the most amazing pieces of literature ever written, suddenly became a piece of crap, simply by dint of the fact that it wasn't really him. I mean, where do you see that kind of, was there a temptation for you to go, I can just make this fiction, or what was the reason for keeping it so close to who you were?
I suppose at the time, I don't think I would do that again, but I'm glad I did. But at the time, I was really heavily influenced by my exposure to a lot of American writers, which is unsurprising, I guess, for an Australian writer. And I mean, a lot of writers of my generation, I suppose, that, really influenced by people like Kerouac and a lot of the beat writers and that kind of
That's a
American.
surprise to hear you say that. Kerouac was your generation, is that right?
Well, no, I mean,
The sort of age group you're out of, is that
well,
what you mean?
yeah. In terms of influence, I think the big ones was still like Kerouac was kind of coming through a revival, I think, at that time, and Raymond Carver. Everybody wanted to be Raymond Carver in my sort of peer group, I suppose, and the idea was that I sort of, by osmosis, I guess. I mean, it's explicit in Kerouac, but is that you are on some sort of mission to tell the truth and to be some sort of camcorder for God or something, where you're just recording the experiences and sort of reporting on on the world as you see it in some way, and you must stick closely to the truth and so on. And like you say, you take On the Road or something like that with Kerouac. Obviously, it's fiction and changes all the names, but by the time I got around to it, it's well understood that all those names can be easily decoded to be the real people,
Right.
and there was already versions of the novel which were released which had the actual names reinserted back into it and so on. And we, with the training I had, like with people like Gertrude Stein and sort of the autobiography of Alice B. Toklas and things like that. And I suppose genuinely, I almost embarrassed to say it, but I think I had in my mind the idea, which is incredibly pretentious, I suppose, that by calling the character Luke Carman, it would somehow increase the fiction of it rather than make it autobiographical. Like, so it would sort of highlight the fact that this isn't reality. It's a fictional representation of somebody's subjective experience of blah, blah, blah. And that was genuinely the logic I was running with at the time. And, I almost immediately found out that that's meaningless.
Everyone just saw through that straight away, right?
That's right. My clever ruse was very easily torn asunder. So
I suppose you could call what you're describing, if you were looking for a hybrid term, you could maybe call it gonzo fiction, couldn't you?
Yes, that would I really like that. That's a really great term for what it is. And Hunter S. Thompson, again, the same sort of energy in that kind of writing that I was really attracted to with Kerouac, with the sort of manic and sort of histrionic kind of approach to life that they were recording, and that was that was really appealing to me, and because sort of by contrast, I found Australian fiction, which we did touch on at university when I was a student, but not in any exhaustive kind of way. Or maybe I accepted the cliche of Australian writing as being quite dull, dun coloured and boring, and and full of cliches about the bush and all this sort of thing, which I don't accept anymore. But at the time, comparatively, American westward energy and exceptionalism was really exciting.
But fear and calling a book Fear and Loathing in Rudy Hill doesn't have quite the same ring to it, does it?
It sounds good now, actually.
Fear and Loathing in Rudy Hill RSL.
Yeah, absolutely. That's on the money. Yeah. That's coming out, I guarantee.
Okay, cool. You heard it here first, folks. Yeah. So I guess the next thing I'd written down after this, where I said it would have been easy to call the protagonist Dave and instead of Rudy Hill. Did you hope to provoke that question? Were you hoping that, you've just told me that it was a ruse, so I guess that question's a little bit moot now, but I guess...
Well, I think the more important, like the truth of it was that fundamentally a want-to-be writer, that, and probably like a lot of young writers who were going after the first publication, that was the end goal. There was, to the extent that I didn't even consider what comes after the book gets published, in terms of even being read. Like, and that sounds, I know that sounds, I know how that sounds, but for example, that An Elegant Young Man was part of this series called the Short Series with Giramondo. Square books. I've got it here. It's a square book, and they have sort of semi-minimal kind of covers and either. But to me, it was when I first saw that series. Non-commercial. It's not a novel. It's not easily identifiable as anything. To the extent that was part of the series' trouble was that in booksellers would say we can't sell these because people don't know what the hell they are.
You don't know where to put it. Yeah.
Yeah, people don't know what it is when they look at it, and so when An Elegant Young Man came out as part of that series, the series I think, which at that time included established writers, people like Brian Castro, and I think he's had just come out just before mine, and I don't think they weren't sellers. They didn't sell. I'm not sure if that's true, but I believe that's true for all of them. And so I was a first-time author, and my book was coming out in the same series. There was no reason to believe for a second that people were going to read it, which is ridiculous. But I didn't care. My dream was to be a published author, not to be necessarily read. And so the idea that I would have to answer questions about it or that anyone would ask me about it was just too far-fetched to even consider. I think that's where I was coming from at the time.
Yeah. What do you make of this idea that I remember Anthony Eaton, who is at University of Canberra in the creative writing program there, and I was heading down to Canberra at one point, and he and I are friends, and I said, look, do you have any guest lectureships going at the moment? I'm going to head down. And he went, to be honest with you, once the book comes out, we really don't need to hear from the writer anymore. He said, we actually don't. He said, much as I like you as a person, we don't care what you think about when you wrote it. Has that been your experience in the academic world?
Actually, it's, to be honest, just in general, I don't know about the academic world, but just in general, I found it to be the opposite. I found that I was more surprised by the fact that people really do. To put it in context, before I was a published author, I never went to any festivals, never went to author talks, or I would read interviews with authors and so on, but I was more interested always in the work than some idea of the author, especially with popular fiction, genre fiction. The less I know about the author, the better, because it's all in the story as far as I was concerned at the time. And the fact that that was the number one marketing approach. Like when I don't know how you find it, but when you're an author, I found that publishing really does mean using yourself as the tool rather than the work. And I'm not saying that as some sort of purist, like, oh, if only they focused on the work or whatever, but it surprises me that there really is an interest in, I think there's more of an interest in authors than there is in novels.
I guess it really, to some extent, it comes down to who the writer is. So, for example, somebody like Marcus Zusak or Melina Marchetta, who have written something that is a household name as a book. I see them go to festivals and students want to talk predominantly about the book and what were you thinking when you did this and why did you make that creative decision when you were writing Alibrandi and so forth. Whereas for someone like myself who has published lots of books, but very few, if any, of them are what you consider household names in school libraries, people want to ask me about my expertise as a writer, not about the work that I've written. So
that might be the distinction. Yeah, you might be right. It might be just until you are in the imagination, till you capture the imagination of a particular audience or reader. Up until then, you're just useful in terms of mining for the idea of how do you do this, or how can I do this? I don't know. It's been surprising altogether, and the academic world is still a mystery to me. It sounds like it it's always been a bit of a mystery to you too. I really don't know if I'm still. I've been in that world for a long time. I think of myself as an outsider there, you know, like a writer who has adapted to university life out of necessity. I still don't feel comfortable as an academic, or wouldn't put myself in that. I have nothing interesting to say as an academic or scholar or anything like that, but it's
Well,
fascinating.
yeah, I mean, I was reading. We'll get on to your second book in a little while, but I was reading some of that this morning, and I was struck by something you said about. Well, you've already alluded to it in this conversation, but the idea that people would use a creative writing program as being basically the hoop you need to jump through. And you talk about the piles of unsolicited manuscripts by the lecturers themselves. And it sort of struck me that, because I've had a lot of people ask me over the years, should I go and do a creative writing program? And my answer has always been do you want to learn something new? Then sure, go and do it. Do you think that's going to be what's going to get you to the top of the slush pile? Then think again, because that's meaningless. I mean, am I singing to the choir in saying that to you? Is that the response that you would give as well?
Yeah, almost identical. I mean, I think, yeah, you can learn a lot by going and doing a degree in creative writing, but it's not going to make you, if you like, a viable, publishable author. I mean, that's a whole other thing. And with the discussion of slush piles, one of the alarming thing for me was when I was put onto them by, I would just hang around a lot of anywhere where publishing was taking place. I would just put myself there, you know, because I found that after a while, if you're just in the room at the right time, somebody might have use of you as a writer. And
that's
so
why you became a photocopy repairman, wasn't it?
that's exactly right.
Get
Yeah,
yourself in the
that's
room.
right. Yeah.
I install telephones in publishing houses exclusively.
That's exactly it. Yeah, and I would be put on slush pile reading. You know, I've read through slush piles as sort of the lowest ranking person in any particular office who they could trust to read through the unsolicited manuscripts, which is what a slush pile is for anyone who's not familiar. But you would, most unsolicited manuscripts come with, you know, a cover letter and a CV, and you would look at the CV and it would say, I've been a lecturer for 15 years at such and such university, I've won all these awards, and and you'd get through the first paragraph and you think, okay, and you toss it aside, not because it was necessarily awful, but because, you know, this publisher is not going to want it.
Mm.
It's like this, and the slush pile is full of experts. And that was a terrifying discovery for me, because I thought, well, I'm nobody and nothing yet. How am I going to get ahead of these people who've been doing it for 20 years? You know.
But the thing is, doesn't that require you then to change your thinking a little bit? Because there's two ways you can go with that. You can go, how am I ever going to find myself to the top of this pile? Or you can go, geez, that's written by the head lecturer, insert university name here, and I can write better than this.
Well, that's the other side of it.
You know, without being conceited, but there are those moments, are they, where you read something that's just on an award or whatever, and you know, we know that awards are judged by people, so there's variations in, you know, what's considered literary or whatever. But we've all had books that we've read on different lists that our books haven't got onto, and gone, cripes, that mine's considerably better than that, I thought.
Absolutely. There's this. I mean, you learn how arbitrary these things are, and how little you can invest in a lot of the authority around it. You know, the experts, critics, awards, so on. I mean, you have to give them their due, and there is some meaning to it. But it I always think of when I was younger, especially. I mean, I know Charles Bukowski is a jerk. Everybody knows that he was a jerk. But there was one thing that I always took comfort. I still take comfort in hearing him say in an interview, speaking of, you know, dubious authority, but he said that the reason I write isn't because I'm so great. There's nothing great about me. It's just I look around and they're all so terrible. And I think one of the things you realize is that the difference between the greatest writer in the world and you might be pretty large, but that's not the criteria. That's not what you have to accomplish. You just have to be, I think you just have to have some faith in your own style, and eventually you get through. And the bar isn't really that high, I don't think.
Is that what you're alluding to in that in the first main story first main essay in your book, where you talk about people surrounding themselves with what they think is going to make them who they want to be, rather than actually dedicating themselves to the craft? I hope I haven't paraphrased you there, but I mean, my view has always been that a writer does their best work when they're a bit insular from what's going on around them. And you talk about not feeling at home in the academic world, and is that because you feel like the academic world is surrounded by people who are focusing on the wrong thing? And without wanting to try to make things awkward for you by answering that, but you know what I'm saying?
No, of course, yeah, absolutely. I think mostly in that in the getting square in the jerking circle essay, one of the things I was really appalled by is that seeing particularly young people, even younger than I was at the time that I wrote that trying to be something, trying to fit in some way, and to me, trying to be part of something, or trying to, at worst, trying to maneuver politically or socially in some way into the publishing world. And to me, that's the absolute antithesis to what writing is all about. As you say, to right or wrong, as small-minded as it might be, my ideal of writing is, because it's the way that it came to me, is an insular kind of one, or an isolated kind of one. You in the room reading the book,
working at a glacial pace, effectively.
Exactly. Yeah. And I find, I forget where this quote comes from, but it comes to mind at the moment, that any decent writer should be in at least 2 senses an emigre. And I think that outsiders, misfits, people who don't quite square with the world around them and the reality around them, I think that's the natural lot for a writer. At least I maybe feel a bit defensive about that, because I think, well, if you see somebody who can sort of swoop in into the writing world, into the fiction world, and is totally comfortable and at home and fashionable and charismatic and so on, it makes me very envious. The writing world should be secured for misfits forever. I don't want everybody else getting in there.
We haven't quite reached the point with publishing that they've reached with entertainment and cooking, where they sort of assemble a whole bunch of people, give them some tasks, and then go, "You're now the best chef in Australia." We haven't reached that point yet, but
that's
maybe
right.
There's an opportunity there.
I do mention reality television precisely for that reason, I think, in that essay, because I think that's where I would hate for us to end up. Is the most consumable person is the best.
Don't go anywhere at the end of this recording, though, because I want to have a chat with you about an idea for a TV show that we could set up.
A reality
Australia's
show.
Next Great Writer. Yeah.
Excellent.
It'll be a very boring show. I understand what you're saying, and I completely concur. I know that in the children's and YA industry, of which I'm probably more a part of that than the world that you occupy, but I've had people actually say to me, people who are involved in these really active networks, and network is the key word in this. They'll say, I've actually had someone say to me, you need to understand that it's 90% how you network and 10% of how good your writing is.
Yeah.
And I think even if that's true, that's not a world I want to be part of. It's a little bit sad, I think.
Well, I don't know what it is, but I remember I had just to be a bit of, a name dropper, I suppose, but I was at a symposium, something like that, in Western Sydney a long time ago now, and it was a China-Australia Literary Forum, and we were lucky enough, whoever had organised it had gotten some of the top writers from China, extremely popular writers, to come and give talks, and it was a surreal experience because they would give their talks in Chinese, in Mandarin, whatever they were speaking, and then the translator would translate directly everything they just said, and then we'd have the English people, and the English people would speak, and then that would be translated. And it was a really exhausting mental experience. But all of a sudden, people started to realize that in the audience was Kurt Sayer, and there was a few slow build up of energy, I suppose, where people were just getting more and more excited, especially the Chinese writers and their fans in the audience, that he was there in the crowd, and people were taking photos of him and getting him to sign things and so on. And he's an international superstar of fiction. And somebody, I think it was Professor Anthony Ullman at the university, said, "Well, I'm going to introduce you to Kurt." Oh, Jesus, don't introduce me to him. I have no idea what to say. I can't for the life of me think of what I'm going to say. But just as I was introduced to him, somebody else quickly jumped in, and thank God, and asked him with a question I thought was just exactly what I needed to hear. They asked him, what's the secret to writing? Something like that. Something really ridiculous like that, as if he's going to... And he took a moment to think it through. And he said, "I don't know, something to do with individuality." And then he just pivoted and turned away and walked off. And, everybody followed after him, whatever. But I was like, yeah, that's fine with me. If to Kurt Sayer, that's what writing is, something to do with it.
If he can't put it in better words than that, then why
exactly.
should I have to?
Exactly. But it's enough to me to think that might be the case, to be satisfied in saying that I really don't think that, literary cliques and, political gaming and, networking and making the right connections is where the focus should be for anyone who's interested in writing, and if that makes us elitist or whatever, then, or you're small-minded or naive or whatever, then it's okay.
Well, I was going to tell you my famous writer story that's quite a little bit similar to yours, but it actually goes into the point that you just made. It was Annie Proulx at the Sydney Writers Festival, and there's 250 people in the room, and they're doing Q&A, and this one poor soul, like a sacrificial lamb, stood up in the middle. He got the microphone, and he said, "Ms. Proulx, can I ask you a question?" He said, "I've written a book and I've sent it to every publisher. I've done a whole bunch of writing groups. I've sent it to some agents. I've sent it to overseas publishers, local publishers. I've sent it to a whole bunch of people, and no one wants to publish it. Do you have any advice for me?" And she leaned into the microphone and said, "Write better." Which is, it's kind of savage, but there's something in it as well, I think.
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's been the case with you, but I never feel... I've never accomplished what I've set out to do as a writer. And, I think you always want to...
What did you set out to do? I mean, initially you said you just wanted to be a writer. Once you'd ticked that box, what was next? Well,
even with the book where the first book, An Elegant Young Man, I suppose I don't know exactly what I was trying to accomplish as I was writing it, because I've forgotten largely. But I know when I look back at it, I'm horrified about a great deal of it. Especially since to me, it's the work of, someone who was 25 years old. And, for instance, I look at the jokes that I tried to put in it, and think, oh God, I think, part of the reason people write another book is because they're trying to correct the mistakes they made last time, and I think that's a good situation. You always want to be developing, I think. I would hate to get to the point where I just think, well, I'll just do what I did last time, and that'll be okay, because it takes a lot of energy and motivation to write a book, and it's got to be worthwhile,
But aren't they the people who make all the money, the ones who find their
I-
formula and stick to it? And my wife said to me several times, book X, why don't you just write more of that one? I go, well,
yeah. Well, that's an interesting thing, because I think because of the being around the university and being around a lot of non-commercial publishers, or non-commercial authors, I do hear a lot of talk about, this is all I can write. This is what my, some sense of integrity tells me that this is my subject and I follow that. And, like, for instance, I've got a chapter in Intimate Antipathies, which is about Gerald Murnane, and, Gerald Murnane is, he's kept the faith for a long time, writing his very unique style, before he's been recognised. I think, he's 80, he must be 81 this year, and there was a long wasteland of indifference in his career. Couldn't give it away, I think, for a long time there. And I've been around a lot of writers like that. But at the same time, I think, I do get frustrated with it, thinking that, okay, no matter how much integrity you have and how much of a vision you have, and I do think there is something to be said to trying to appeal to readers as a writer. I mean, I know that sounds asinine, but I think, even if you're the greatest stylist in the world and you have the most amazing technical virtuosity, if you really, I do lose patience with the writers who think that they can go without readers altogether.
And I think I have in my lighter moments. I don't entirely agree with my own statement here, but I have said on occasion that I like it when the Booker shortlist comes out, because I know that 6 books I'm not going to have to bother with this year.
Well, yeah, I do see so much of that. Like, I remember a couple of years ago, many years ago now, probably, I saw a list of, books that the experts, it was in the, Morning Herald, Telegraph, something, probably the Herald, I suppose. The critics give the top picks for the summer's best books or whatever. And I noted that article because somebody put An Elegant Young Man on it, and I was like, oh, this is so wonderful, awesome. And I scrolled down, and the first comment was, well, I can't wait not to read any of these books. It's like, well, that's fair enough. I mean,
it reminds me of the New York agent that was sent a book by someone that he knew he didn't like, and he received the manuscript, and he wrote back and said, "Thank you for sending me your manuscript. I shall waste no time reading
it." That's it. Yeah.
You talked about the writer who reaches 80 and has finally kind of gone. What makes you go that one more step, do you think? I mean, for example, people talk about, and it's almost certainly couched in myth, but they talk about Harry Potter being submitted 37 times before someone picked it up. So there's 36 publishers out there right now going, holy crap, what did I do? And if that number's true, I know that I wouldn't have got to number 37. I reckon my benchmark would be about 8 before I'd go, this is clearly a sign that I shouldn't be doing this. So I guess what I'm asking you is, you were 25 when your first book came out, as I was about the same age. Do you think things would be different if you'd had to wait a bit longer?
I don't think so. I don't think I would never have given up. And I think of, we already mentioned On the Road as an example. And On the Road was, projected for 10 years or something like that. I think it was finished in 47, published in 57, something like that. I'm a Giramondo publisher, and almost certainly the most popular Giramondo book, the most successful Giramondo book, is Alexis Wright's Carpentaria, and that's, I don't know exactly, but apparently every publisher turned their nose up at that. Totally incomprehensible. Couldn't deal with it at all. And now, if you look at the Penn Anthology of Australian Literature or by Macquarie University or something like that, it's mentioned in the introduction to that collection as being the most important Australian work in the 21st century. And I don't know if I would have persisted with a manuscript that was rejected, but I wouldn't have given up on writing. And I
guess that's the
don't know.
key, isn't it? Yeah,
I think so.
Whether you've got faith in your one manuscript, or whether you have faith in what you can achieve as a writer.
Yeah, I think there's a difference. I heard it said, a long time ago, I can't remember where, but the two basic approaches to success in the artistic endeavor is to either be some sort of prodigy who is brilliant off the starting mark, or you're somebody who learns by consistent failure. And I'm certainly in that second category. Everything I do is hit and miss, and it's the old Hemingway thing of 99 pages of shit and 1 page of gold. Sometimes you write something that isn't good enough to go in your neighbor's trash and all that sort of thing. And I know, for example, for An Elegant Young Man, there was certain sections in that which ended up being, say, there was one particular section in that which was sort of the extreme example of it, which ended up being 4,000 words or something like that. A section which was 4,000 words, which was genuinely 80,000 words in the original manuscript. It was hacked that far down until all the fat was off it. And I mean, that's sort of a hybrid example where it's like, well, the manuscript wasn't a failure, but 80% of it was.
And the whole thing probably would have been if you hadn't had the good sense to actually make that change. Then that may have scuttled the whole thing, right?
That's right. And I think in some of the examples you're talking about, like whether it gets passed around until someone finally sees its value, is a lot of the time you need someone who can see the value in it. I think that's what a really good editor is all about, is finding what works and finding and knowing how to maximize that. And I think that's part of the reason why, for a lot of young writers, what they should possibly be doing is looking around to see where works are being published which mean something to them. So when I was, I often get asked, like, where should I send my work? Or, by young writers or apprentice writers, where should I send my work? Or who do I speak to? Or what are editors or publishers looking for? But the other side of it, which I don't think people think of very much with young writers, is what do you want out of it? Like, what do you care about? Who's doing what is interesting to you? And, Giramondo was interesting to me way before they would return my emails. I hounded. I used to email him, 6 or 7 times. It must have been. I must have been emailing him once a month. I just hounded him, and because I liked his work, I respected his work as an editor and a publisher, and so getting his attention and getting his approval and being accepted into Giramondo was a dream come true for me.
At the beginning of what's the full name? Intimate Antipathies. Thank you. It's written right here in front of me. I should have just said it. In the introduction, or the first part of that, you tell a story about being out for an evening. And did the mugging thing happen the same evening as the lady pressed her breasts against the glass? that the same night, or was it a different experience?
It's amazing you picked that up, because no, it didn't.
Okay, so all right, well, let me back up then. So that's a different story. The very amusing story about the lady pressing her breasts against the glass, and Fiona Wright having something very pithy to say. But you're in the streets of the inner west, and you were effectively mugged, or somebody attempted to mug you. And well, why don't you tell the story? How does this lead into this book that we have in front of us now?
Well, the way that the connection that I saw was, it just so happened that I went to, it wasn't the event that I described in the.
I've just blurred those two stories together, obviously.
No, it is in the essay. It is, but I did go to a literary event, but it was completely uneventful, and so I cut and pasted the event that I mentioned in there, because I thought that was a surreal and interesting kind of example of what the literary life is like, and what poetry readings amount to, I suppose, for better or worse. And I was coming home from a admittedly different literary event, a reading at a library, and I'd had a few drinks, and someone tried to mug me in the middle of the street, just came running up to me and demanded that I give them my wallet. And first I was really stunned, and I moved back into the road, stupidly thinking that he can't rob me in the road because it's too dangerous. But
well, if you get run down by a taxi, he can't rob you, can he?
That's right. If I'm already dead, yeah, And but it was the middle of the night, and this guy came after me, and he was desperately, he really wanted my wallet. Is what I'm getting at. And I was looking at him, and I realized this guy's just a kid. No, he's bigger than me, but he's just a kid. And I started I don't know what inspired me to do it, but I just started abusing him. It's like, I just was so mad that this guy was trying to rob me. And bizarrely, instead of just beating me over the head or stabbing me to death, as he had every right to do at that point, he just sank down into the gutter. Probably not a professional thief. Maybe he was just giving it a go.
Doesn't sound like it.
And he just started crying in the gutter. But I couldn't stop myself from abusing it. I was just ranting and raving and abusing this kid, to the extent that some people came and chased me away. They chased me away from this guy.
Leave him alone.
So I ran off into the shadows and left him sort of sitting there
to be consoled by the onlookers,
by these heroes. Yeah. And later on, I was thinking about the chain of events. Going to this literary event and reading this work, and it all seemed it seemed like to me just generally like a perfect contrast between the writing world and the real world, and how one tends to distort the other. Because my reaction to this guy was not worldly. It was stupid, and it was ridiculous, and it caused a kind of bizarre reaction in him. And I felt kind of ashamed to think back, like I went to this literary event and was drinking wine and whatever, and then this poor kid comes over, and I'm ranting and raving and frothing at the mouth at him. And then I thought it was just a good way to introduce a couple of things. One is that that's kind of how I feel about my writing, is that it's a kind of raving and frothing and a kind of grotesque thing. I mean, I'm not putting it down. I think there's just something manic and crazed about it, because that's a side of myself that comes out in the writing. And yeah, I also wanted to foreground that unhinged nature, which I think goes hand in hand with, in my experience, the writer's life. I mean, you don't meet many writers who are well. In my, I mean, that was a big part of what I was thinking about, is just how disordered the writing life is and how disordered writers are generally as a result,
Well,
or vice versa.
I used to hang out with a couple of people who were fairly active in the Sydney stand-up comic scene, the comedy scene. And I was never brave enough to get up and do it, but I've watched plenty of people bomb and I've watched plenty of people kill. It's very, very violent language, the comedy world. You're either killing or you're dying, getting him off is dying, or man, you killed that. But my observation was that the people who came off stage just going, oh yeah, man, I totally killed it. Oh, and they were sort of full of bravado. You'd go, I'm not sure what show you thought you put on, because what I saw was a room full of people just awkwardly shifting in their seats and, moths on spotlights. But the ones who came back and put their head in their hands and went, oh man, the joke about the pregnant nun didn't land, and oh, they hate me, they were almost invariably the ones who had absolutely slayed that night. And I kind of think that's often similar with the writing world, don't you think?
Yeah, it's part of why I did when I was doing my doctorate, I shifted focus to talk about shame and to explore shame, is because that's a big part of where what was driving me, I think, as a writer. And just to bring it once more back to Kerouac, I think that's why I really liked Kerouac, is because he was probably the supreme self-conscious exponent of American letters. That's what his writing was all about. It was just about his extreme self-consciousness, which I think heightened him to everything, because the filter through which he was experiencing everything was just so highly sensitive, and so things became kind of hyper real through his lens, because he couldn't leave himself behind for a second, and that's why I think that's part of the reason I was drawn to his work, and that's part of the reason why some of my work is so hyperbolic and over the top and so on, is because I think it's an expression of that self-consciousness sort of erupting in a way.
Well, I was going to kind of shift to that, the shame in Australian literature. And, shame is a word that encompasses a whole bunch of different, you're just talking about Kurt Zare and his book Shame, which is, I think one of the most astonishing pieces of writing I've ever read. It just floored me. But it surprised me a little bit to hear you talk about shame in the context of yourself. Were you ever ashamed, or were you ever reluctant to call yourself a writer?
Oh, absolutely. That's the two things just seem to magnify each other. Like the one, I think, sort of, a dissatisfaction with reality is probably a necessity for any writer, because why else obsess about an alternate version in the first place? But
or create a completely new world that tells the same story in a different world.
Exactly. And when I was doing my thesis, I came across, well, first of all, growing up, I didn't know anyone who was a writer. The idea that you would even pursue that as an occupation was just ridiculous. Still is, to most people in my non-writerly life.
Don't aim so high, son. Be an astronaut.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And I told the story, 100,000 times with An Elegant Young Man, which I put it in there. There was a genuine magical moment where, I was a very shy, bookish kid, and my neighbour was really, super cool. He was, absolutely, supremely confident in everything he did. He was streetwise and, tough guy and all this, and gangster. And but he was always friendly to me. I'd wave to him and so on. And then one day I was walking into the house, and he saw me and he says, "Hey, come here." And I went over and he goes, "I figured you out, bro. I figured you out." And I as usual, I didn't say anything. I was just tremulous in front of this guy. He's like, "You want to be a writer?" And I was just floored. Like, how the hell could this guy possibly know that about me? And he says, don't worry about it. You should do it. You should become a writer, bro. And I was like, really? You think so? And he goes, yeah, you know what? You should write a book. You should call it How to Be Gay. And then he just turned around and he walked off. And it was just this perfect moment, because it's like, I don't know, I still to this day, I don't know how he knew that. Like, maybe he didn't. Maybe he was, but it doesn't matter. I mean, it was the perfect encapsulation for me of everything that wanting to be a writer was about.
Sounds like he was still in year 10. That's the kind
yeah,
of
exactly. That's exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That'd be good.
When I finally got to university, I was doing the thesis. I found that shame is a big thing in the discourse around connecting shame and literature is quite strong. There's some really interesting ideas in there, and one of them, I've just momentarily forgotten the guy's name. He's an American academic, and his big claim was that shame is actually the structure of literature. It's the condition of literature. It's born out of a shame, the shame that comes along with being literate in the first place is just such an injustice in its own right, that everything that we write is in some way trying to make up for that inequality in some way. And totally crazy, but I really totally related to it in a way.
I've seen a lot of kids, not just in Western Sydney, but very much in Western Sydney, high school students, where somebody reads something aloud to the group and the others are all like, oh, shame, and they sometimes actually use that word. And then that's it, they're done for the day. I mean, how do you get past that as somebody who works with young people or people who are new writers? How do you get them to push past that point of going, part of doing what you do is pouring yourself onto the page, or exposing yourself effectively?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point and a really good question. And it's something that, because I don't do it anymore, in part because it's really hard, but going into schools and doing workshops and that sort of thing, that's one of the main things that I would encounter as well, is, how do you get people to get through that feeling, which is totally paralyzing and debilitating. You can't write when you're actually, I think, when you're in the extremes of shame, when you're actually enduring that social moment of shame. You can do it later on when you're at home and you're on your own and you're sort of able to get back at the world that made you feel that way or something.
Well, I guess adolescence is one of those times where you're on a knife's edge of acceptance or rejection, aren't you? And you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're teetering and you could fall one way. You'd rather sort of stay in the safe place you're in.
Oh yeah. Like it's exactly the way I dealt with it was by doing nothing about it until I got out of high school. Basically, there was no way I was going to write when I was in high school. I didn't even read for the last few years, even at home on my own, because I just felt that I didn't want anything to do with a person who would do that.
Do you think that's still the case, or do you think that's shifted a bit?
I don't know. I don't see it as much. Like I still sometimes teach at still sometimes a tutor at the university, and a lot of young people that come through, happy to read. They're not embarrassed by it. They have their opinions about it, but that's a self-selecting group. I don't know what it's like out in the. I imagine a big part of. I could be wrong, but I think one of the things that might change that is poetry slams and the kind of the culture of performing your reading, which is really popular in Western Sydney. I always was kind of cynical about performance poetry and that sort of thing growing up, but I was taken to a few poetry slams in Parramatta and so on, and I would see kids get up 13, 14, whatever, all the way up to all young people look the same to me, whatever age they are. They would get up and they were so confident, just no shame whatsoever. really bold and powerful and capable and celebrating each other, you know, like in the way that
with the finger
poets,
snaps.
exactly, with that clicking stuff. And you know, it was amazing. I wouldn't be surprised if that had follow-on effects to all kinds of other forms and styles and so on. And
Well, word to the wise from somebody who recently took part in his first poetry slam at Roskilde. My word to the wise is this: don't get up and read your Civil War poems that you wrote under the tutelage of Judith Beveridge at Sydney University, because you're going to be looked at like you're some kind of warmonger because you did a poem about muskets. But anyway, it was very revealing. It was I've been presenting for years and I don't get nervous anymore, but I was kind of crapping myself that night. It was. And when I sat down, I thought I had every right to be crapping myself because this has gone exactly as badly as I thought it would.
Yeah, well, years and years ago, I had a very similar experience at the Street University in Liverpool.
Mm-hmm.
I was, after each performance, you know, everything, I was just totally out of place in every possible way. And after every reading, the participants would celebrate by tagging the wall with graffiti. And they handed me the thing, and I just wrote my name like such a dork on the wall. I don't know how to do graffiti, you know, just sat down.
Luke was here. Yeah,
yeah, that's right, you know. So I see where you're coming from. I understand.
Yeah, anyway, that's another story for another time. I got one last question for you. At what point in writing Antipathies did you go, my backlist isn't long enough to be saying these things. I'm going to be judged by the length of my backlist. You know, should I be leaving this as somebody who's got 100 books to their name or a Pulitzer or whatever? Did that moment ever cross your mind?
Oh no. I know going in. This is one of those books where you sometimes hear others say that my editor, my publisher, pushed me. Very gently, but I was really of the opinion that, you know what, I have no right to my second book to be a book of essays, because who the hell am I to talk about anything in that way, you know? Because it kind of assumes, you know, and I think that anybody can write an essay about anything they want and should do so, you know, even if they don't have anything to say. You know, Gore Vidal said, "I have nothing to say, only to add." I don't have anything to say. I've just got words to add. And he convinced me that it wouldn't be a terrible idea and it wouldn't be a disaster. And I don't know. I'm glad that I did it, because for me there were things which I think as an author I needed to get over psychologically, not because I was not because of trauma, but just because they were present, they were foremost in my mind, and I thought, if I don't deal with these now, they're going to get in the way of whatever I want to do next anyway, you know.
So clear the decks and say what you have to say and then get on with it. Exactly.
And, you know, having done it now, I'm really very, very keen to get back to straight fiction, real fiction, fake fiction, whatever. And
we didn't even get to talk about your loathing for writers who live in Melbourne, which is apparently a thing, even though it's not really a thing, right?
Oh yeah. It's highly exaggerated.
Well, anyone watching, just go to YouTube and type in Luke Carman, Melbourne hates you, and you probably come. No, I think it was you wrote. Was it a response to this piece here that led to the outcry from certain people in a certain state south of where we are?
Yeah, it was. It's as I've come to accept that that will probably be the thing I'm remembered for. You know,
there's worse things.
There's worse things, and you know, it's nice to be remembered. You know,
exactly.
But you know, that's it was such an. I must have, although I might have been completely out of my mind and completely wrong about everything that I was saying, there must have been something to it to get that kind of reaction out of people.
Well, look, the first thing I thought about when I read about this was, because I missed it the first time around, it was when I was researching this that I came across it. But the first thing that came to mind was that old thing, if you have to ask how much that is, you can't afford it. And if you feel that you have to respond really aggressively to this thing about wankers in the writing industry, maybe you're one of those wankers in the writing industry.
Yeah. I mean, I told myself that it was a success in that sense, that if it was a trap, then people fell for it. If
We're going to wrap it up because we've been talking for about an hour. But look, I've really enjoyed talking to you, Luke. I always do. Maintain that rage, man. Just thanks so much for speaking to us. I really enjoyed it, and we'll talk again soon.
Thanks, James. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.